the gang known to law enforcement as the Marley Boys first emerged in 2015 as a splinter faction from an older criminal organization called the Beaumont Crew, based in the Leighton and Walthamstow districts of the London Borough of Waltham Forest in East London. The name Marley Boys derives from the Somali community, a reference to the ethnic heritage of many of the gang's founding members. Though from the outset, the organization was ethnically diverse in its wider membership. The gang is also known by the names Mali Strip and Mali Strip, and their primary areas of operation encompass the E10 and E17 postcodes in the northeastern reaches of Greater London. The origins of the Marley Boys lay with the older and once dominant Beaumont Crew gang, also known as Let's Get Rich, or LGR, which was located on the Beaumont estate in Leighton. Somali members of this earlier organization, having gained access to the drugs market from more experienced Jamaican elders, eventually organized the Somali youth under their direction and broke away to form their own enterprise. In doing so, they became rivals of their former associates and filled a power vacuum in the local drug trade that had emerged as a result of law enforcement pressure on established criminal networks. It is worth reflecting on the development of this East London borough with which the Marley Boys would become so intrinsically associated. The London Borough of Waltham Forest was formed in 1965 by the amalgamation of three former municipal boroughs, Chingford, Leighton and Walthamstow, which were transferred to Greater London from the historic county of Essex. The area takes its name from the former Waltham Forest, an ancient institution which managed deer in southwest Essex, a remnant of which survives today as Epping Forest along the borough's eastern and northern fringes. The River Lee lies to the west, where its associated marshes and reservoirs form a green corridor separating North and East London. The main centres of population in the borough are Chingford in the north, Walthamstow in the centre, and Leighton and Leytonstone to the south. Throughout the 20th century, the area developed rapidly from a collection of Essex villages into densely populated London commuter suburbs. Large-scale housing construction followed, particularly in the post-war decades, when tower blocks and council estates were erected across the borough to accommodate the growing population. The Beaumont estate in Leighton, constructed in the 1960s, originally consisted of three 20-story towers containing some 360 flats, along with 23 low-rise blocks. It would later become synonymous with gang activity. The demographic character of Waltham Forest shifted considerably in the latter half of the 20th century. Caribbean communities settled in the area from the 1950s onwards, followed by waves of immigration from South Asia, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. Of particular significance was the arrival of Somali refugees in the 1990s, fleeing the civil war which had erupted in their homeland following the collapse of the Somali government in 1991. By the 2021 census, the population of Waltham Forest had reached approximately 278,400 residents, and the borough ranked among the top 20 most diverse areas in the country, with an estimated 47% of residents from minority ethnic backgrounds. Waltham Forest also has the fifth largest Muslim population in England. Yet this diversity existed alongside significant deprivation. In 2010, the borough ranked as the 15th most deprived in England, and although this has improved somewhat in subsequent years, pockets of unemployment, poverty and social exclusion persisted in areas such as Leighton, and parts of Walthamstow. It was in this environment that gang culture had taken root from the late 1990s onwards. A seminal study conducted in 2007 by Professor John Pitts of the University of Bedfordshire, entitled Reluctant Gangsters, Youth Gangs in Waltham Forest, documented the emergence of gang culture in the borough and its connection to the local drugs trade. Professor Pitts interviewed numerous informants and found that by the late 1990s, 4 families dominated organised crime in Waltham Forest. Among the most significant was a group of brothers living on the Beaumont estate, who, having previously specialised in armed robbery, moved into the highly lucrative narcotics business. By 2001, the Beaumont gang had become the major supplier of drugs in the borough. In 2002, a core member of the Beaumont gang was robbed by someone from the Oliver Close gang, who was in turn attacked by the brother of the victim. The original robbery was likely related to a dispute over a drugs deal. In the ensuing conflict, the Oliver Close gang affiliated with other local groups including Chingford Hall and the Boundary Boys, all of whom harboured smouldering resentments against the Beaumont gang over the way they had muscled in on the drugs business. These early conflicts were characterised by postcode territorialism, an emotional attachment to local areas which led young men to defend their patches from outsiders. Gang members described an almost tribal relationship with their estates and streets. Elders, often of Jamaican heritage, directed younger members to carry drugs and weapons, collect debts, and take the blame for offences if apprehended. The Professor Pitt study assessed the harm levels of various gangs operating in the borough and found the Beaumont gang among the most serious. The rise of gangs like the Beaumont Crew has to be considered in light of broader developments in British gang culture and the particular circumstances of the Somali diaspora in the United Kingdom. The first Somalis to arrive in the United Kingdom were seamen and merchants who settled in port cities in the late 19th century, mainly in Cardiff, Liverpool and London. Many of these early sailors came from British Somaliland and worked in the thriving docks. The United Kingdom had been tied closely to Somaliland through its involvement in the British Somaliland Protectorate, a connection which gave rise to a long tradition of Somali migration to these shores. However, the vast majority of Britain's Somali community arrived far more recently. When civil war erupted in Somalia following the collapse of the government in 1991, it generated a sudden and massive flow of refugees. By the early 1990s, a steady trickle had increased dramatically, with families fleeing the violence and seeking asylum in Britain. Many were women and children, as the men had been killed or remained in Somalia to fight. Further migration followed from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, as Somalis sought to reunite with family members already settled in the United Kingdom. By 2021, census estimates placed the Somali population in Britain at between 108,000 and 176,000 people, with approximately 78% concentrated in London. Established communities formed in Tower Hamlets, Waltham Forest, and other East London boroughs. The Somali community faced considerable challenges upon arrival. Unemployment rates were high, housing was often inadequate, and many found their professional qualifications unrecognised. Young Somalis, in particular, struggled to navigate between the expectations of their traditional culture and the realities of inner-city London life. Some fell through the cracks of educational and social support systems, making them vulnerable to recruitment by criminal enterprises. In some senses, the development of the drugs trade in urban Britain and the evolution of gang structures cannot be disentangled from these broader social pressures. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, British gang culture underwent a significant transformation. The old model of postcode territorialism, in which young men defended their local areas out of emotional attachment, gradually gave way to a more business-driven approach. Researchers such as Professor James Densley documented this shift, describing how gangs progressed through stages of evolution from informal street groups to sophisticated enterprise organizations. The most significant development in this period was the emergence of what became known as county lines drug trafficking. This term describes the practice whereby urban gangs transport illegal drugs from cities to smaller towns and rural areas, using dedicated mobile phone lines to take orders. The National Crime Agency estimates that by 2019, there were over 2,000 individual deal lines operating across the United Kingdom, controlled by criminal networks based primarily in urban centres such as London. A common feature of county lines operations is the exploitation of children and vulnerable adults. Gangs recruit young people, often those excluded from school or in local authority care, to act as drug runners and couriers. These children are groomed with promises of money and status before being coerced through debt bondage and violence. The practice known as cuckooing, in which dealers take over the homes of vulnerable adults to use as distribution bases, became widespread. According to the Children's Commissioner for England, by 2023, at least 27,000 children were believed to be involved in county lines gang activity nationwide. This was the world from which the Mali Boys emerged in 2015, a convergence of community dislocation, evolving gang structures, and an ever-expanding market for illegal drugs. And it was the drug trade that would define the Mali Boys from the outset. From the moment of their formation, the gang focused its energies on the distribution of Class A narcotics, principally crack cocaine and heroin, along with cannabis. The founding members had learned the business while working under more experienced dealers in the Beaumont crew, and they now applied this knowledge to building their own enterprise. Their primary territory centered on Leighton High Road and the surrounding streets, with Valentine Road becoming particularly associated with the gang's activities. Police sources would later describe this stretch as one of the most dangerous streets in the United Kingdom. The Mali Boys moved quickly to establish dominance. Unlike the older postcode gangs, which had focused on defending territory out of emotional attachment, the Mali Boys operated with a more calculating, business-driven mentality. Professor Andrew Whitaker of London's South Bank University, who studied gang culture in Waltham Forest, observed that the emergence of the Mali Boys was best understood as a particular stage in gang evolution rather than an isolated phenomenon. They exemplified the core features of what researchers termed the enterprise phase of gang development. By 2018, police estimated that the gang was generating approximately $50,000 per week from its drug sales in Waltham Forest alone. Individual street dealers working for the organization could earn up to $500 per day. The gang specialized in high-volume, low-value transactions, selling wraps of crack and heroin for as little as $5 to maintain market dominance and undercut competitors. The Mali Boys also began recruiting aggressively from the local youth population. They targeted young people aged 12 to 17, often those who had been excluded from school or who lacked stable family structures. These younger members were used as runners and spotters, carrying drugs and cash, while the older leadership remained at a distance from the street-level operations. In a report commissioned by the local Waltham Forest Council, the gang was described as the most business-driven, violent, and ruthless street gang operating in the borough. Within a few years of their formation, the Marley Boys had eclipsed the Beaumont Crew and other local rivals to become the dominant force in the Waltham Forest drug trade. The methods which the Marley Boys employed to expand their operations were both systematic and ruthless. At the heart of their business model was the county line system of drug distribution. Rather than confining their sales to the streets of Waltham Forest, the gang established supply routes extending far beyond London into provincial markets. Consignments of crack cocaine and heroin were transported by train and rental car to towns in Essex, the Thames Valley, and locations as distant as Scotland. A dedicated mobile phone line, the county line itself, was used to take orders from customers in these importing areas, with drugs then delivered by runners dispatched from London. The gang also engaged extensively in the practice known as cuckooing. This involves taking over the homes of vulnerable adults, typically those suffering from drug addiction or mental health problems, and using their properties as bases for drug storage and distribution. Dealers would move into these addresses, sometimes for weeks at a time, selling directly to local users while the vulnerable occupant remained present. Reports indicated that conditions at cuckooed addresses were often squalid, with multiple gang members coming and going at all hours. The exploitation of children formed a central pillar of the Marley Boys' operations. Young people aged 12 to 17 were recruited to serve as the lowest tier of the organization's hierarchy. These children carried drugs and cash between locations, acted as lookouts for police activity, and took the greatest risks of arrest, while the older leadership insulated themselves from direct involvement. Recruitment often targeted those most vulnerable, including children who had been excluded from school, those in local authority care, and young people from unstable family backgrounds. The process of grooming typically began with gifts of money, clothing, or mobile phones, creating a sense of obligation which was later exploited through debt bondage. Once a young person owed money to the gang, whether through losing drugs to a police seizure or through deliberately engineered debts, they found it extremely difficult to extricate themselves. The gang was known to station boys as young as 10 near police stations to monitor the movements of officers and note the registration plates of their private vehicles. This intelligence was then used to identify and avoid surveillance operations. Unlike many other London gangs which cultivated public notoriety through drill music and social media, the Marley Boys maintained a deliberate policy of anonymity. They were not active on platforms such as YouTube or Instagram in the manner of rivals, preferring to operate in the shadows. It was reported that they used Facebook primarily to monitor police officials rather than to promote themselves. The gang's operational security extended to their communications. Members were known to favor old Nokia handsets rather than smartphones, as these simpler devices were more difficult for law enforcement to track and contained less incriminating data if seized. The hierarchical structure of the organization meant that younger members on the street rarely had direct contact with the senior figures who controlled the supply of drugs. Orders flowed downwards through intermediaries, making it difficult for police to build cases against those at the top. Meanwhile, the gang consolidated its position by absorbing smaller local groups into its network. Drive and Marlow, Boundary, Coppermill, and Stony Down were among the gangs which either allied themselves with the Mali Boys or were effectively subsumed into their operations. This expansion was achieved through a combination of superior drug supply quality and a fearsome reputation for violence against those who resisted. By the late 2010s, the Mali Boys had established themselves as the most influential criminal organization in Waltham Forest, with connections to other organized crime groups across London. The gang structure resembled that of a commercial franchise more than a traditional street gang. An inner leadership core of approximately 40 members, primarily elders aged 17 to 24 from the Somali community, directed a fluid network of younger operatives drawn from diverse ethnic backgrounds. This professionalized approach, prioritizing profit and operational efficiency over postcode pride, marked a broader shift in London gang dynamics, which researchers had been documenting for years. All of this was hidden behind a veil of secrecy that made the Mali Boys particularly difficult for authorities to penetrate. By 2019, the Mali Boys were reported to have between 40 and 50 core members operating across their territory in Leighton and Walthamstow. The gang's internal structure was divided into two principal sets, corresponding to their geographic strongholds. Those operating in the E10 postcode around Leighton were known as El Tizzy, while those based in the E17 postcode around Walthamstow operated under the designation SJ. This division allowed for coordinated control of drug markets across a wide area of Waltham Forest. The organization operated according to a clear hierarchy. At the top sat an inner leadership core, elders aged 17 to 24 who were primarily of Somali heritage and who controlled access to the drug supply. Below them worked a more fluid network of younger street-level operatives, aged 12 to 17, drawn from diverse ethnic backgrounds. These younger members handled the daily business of drug dealing, carrying packages between locations and collecting payments, while the elders remained at a remove from activities which might attract police attention. And this expansion did not stop there. The Mali Boys extended their influence by forming alliances with smaller local gangs or absorbing them outright into their network. Groups such as Drive and Marlow, Boundary, Coppermill, and Stony Down either pledged loyalty to the Mali Boys or found themselves effectively incorporated into the larger organization. This consolidation was achieved through a combination of inducements and intimidation. The Mali Boys could offer superior quality drugs at competitive prices, making alliance economically attractive. Those who resisted faced the prospect of violent retribution. The gang established strongholds at various locations across the borough. Valentin Road in Leighton became particularly notorious, with police sources later describing it as one of the most dangerous streets in Britain. Other operational bases included the Chingford Hall Estate, Coronation Gardens, and stretches of Leighton High Road. These locations functioned less as symbols of postcode pride and more as economic marketplaces, nodes in a distribution network designed to maximize profit. The Mali Boys were not without rivals, however. The Priory Court Gang, also known as Higham Hill, after their territory in Walthamstow, represented the most significant opposition. Tensions between the two groups simmered throughout the late 2010s, occasionally erupting into open violence. The Beaumont crew, from which the Mali Boys had originally splintered, also remained hostile to their former associates. These rivalries would prove to have deadly consequences. Families living in areas controlled by the Mali Boys reported being terrified by the constant presence of gang members and the threat of violence. Some residents refused to leave their homes after dark. Witnesses to crimes were routinely intimidated into silence, making prosecutions difficult. The gang had established what amounted to a parallel authority in parts of Waltham Forest, one enforced not by law but by fear. With ever-increasing profits and territorial control, there also came an ever greater propensity for violence. In May 2017, the simmering tensions between the Mali Boys and their rivals erupted into open warfare. On a spring evening that month, 17-year-old Elijah Dornelly, a member of the Mali Boys, was murdered. The killing was carried out by Ezra Abeka Soares and Morgan Mockford, both 18 years old at the time, who were associated with rival factions in Waltham Forest. The death of Dornelly marked a turning point. What had previously been a commercial rivalry over drug territory now became a blood feud demanding revenge. The Mali Boys responded with escalating brutality. On the 16th of November 2017, a group of approximately 10 young men associated with the gang spotted 18-year-old Qasim Mokrane near a subway station in Walthamstow. Among those leading the attack was Hamza ul Haq, who would later be identified as a central figure in the Mali Boys' leadership. The group chased Mokrane through the streets, brandishing weapons including what prosecutors would later describe as a zombie flasher or pirate knife. In just 25 seconds, Mokrane was surrounded, pushed against a wall, and stabbed repeatedly. He suffered catastrophic injuries, including an eviscerated bowel, and died 4 days later in hospital. The violence did not end there. Later that same month, ul Haq himself was attacked, squirted with acid by rivals, while another Mali Boys member was stabbed. Each assault demanded retaliation. Each retaliation provoked another response. On the 14th of March 2018, 3 hooded figures associated with the Mali Boys approached a van parked in Essex Close, Walthamstow. Inside sat 20-year-old Joseph Williams Torres alongside a friend. The attackers pulled out a firearm and opened fire. Williams Torres was struck in the chest and legs. He died on the way to hospital less than an hour later. Joseph Williams. Torres was not a gang member. His killers had been seeking revenge for the attacks on their associates, but they had targeted the wrong man. Williams Torres bore an uncanny resemblance to their intended victim and wore a similar beanie hat. He was an innocent bystander, caught in the crossfire of a gang war he had no part in. Prosecutor Alison Hunter KC would later describe the Mali Boys as reckless and ruthless, swift to seek revenge for any perceived challenge to their territorial supremacy. Their eagerness to exact swift retribution, she said, typically resulted in either careless, mistaken identification or acts of indiscriminate violence. The cycle of bloodshed showed no signs of abating. In December 2018, the conflict between the Mali Boys and their rivals intensified still further. On the 21st of that month, Daniel Fakoya, a member of the Priory Court gang, drove a stolen car into Leighton High Road, the heart of Mali Boys territory. He was accompanied by 2 other men. The group was heavily armed, carrying a loaded firearm, a long knife, and a bottle of ammonia. The result was a chase through the streets of Leighton as Fakoya and his associates pursued 4 members of the Mali Boys on foot. The terrified gang members fled into an off-license and locked themselves in a back room, hiding until their attackers gave up the hunt. Fakoya, attempting to escape the police, who had been alerted to the disturbance, took a corner too quickly and crashed the stolen vehicle into a shopfront called Moonlight Stores. Narrowly missing pedestrians on the pavement, he fled on foot but left blood on the airbag, which would later identify him as the driver. A loaded handgun was recovered from the footwell of the driver's seat. Fakoya was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison for the offense, along with a separate conviction for conspiracy to supply cocaine after evidence emerged that he had been running a drug line from prison using smuggled mobile phones. The incident demonstrated that the Mali Boys were not the only party willing to employ extreme violence in pursuit of territorial dominance. By the close of 2018, the gang conflict in Waltham Forest had claimed multiple lives and left many more injured. The Metropolitan Police estimated that more than 250 individuals were involved in the 12 gangs operating in Walthamstow and the surrounding areas. Residents in affected neighbourhoods had become prisoners in their own homes, afraid to venture out after dark. Those at the top of the Mali Boys' leadership, including Hamza ul Haq, had been involved in multiple acts of serious violence and yet remained at liberty. The tit-for-tat attacks had grown increasingly bloodied and vengeful, with each side eager to demonstrate that no assault would go unanswered. Prosecutors would later observe that the Mali Boys had grown increasingly angry, dangerous, and confrontational since the murder of Elijah Dornelli, which had marked the beginning of the cycle of violence. Their willingness to strike at anyone associated with rival gangs, or even those who merely resembled their intended targets, meant that the threat extended far beyond the gang members themselves. The violence reached its most notorious climax in January 2019 with the murder of a 14-year-old boy. Jaden Moody was born in Nottingham, where his mother Jada Bailey had raised him. By all accounts, he was a loving and caring boy, fascinated by cars and motorbikes, with ambitions to launch his own clothing line, which he planned to call Young Productions. His mother would later describe him as a remarkable human being who had once handed out gloves to homeless people during the winter months. Yet Jaden had also fallen into trouble. By the age of 13, he had come to the attention of police, and he was subsequently caught in possession of a Rambo knife and cannabis. He appeared in a Snapchat video holding an imitation firearm. When a gang in Nottingham began making threats against him, his mother sent him to stay with relatives in East London, hoping the move would offer him a fresh start away from dangerous influences. It did not. On the evening of the 8th of January, 2019, Jaden was riding a moped through the streets of Leighton. He was 14 years old. Prosecutors would later allege that he was dealing drugs for the Beaumont crew, though his family disputed the extent of his involvement with any gang. What is certain is that 5 members of the Mali Boys were driving through the area that night in a stolen Mercedes, searching for rivals to attack. When they spotted Jaden on his moped, they drove directly into him. The impact catapulted the boy over the bonnet of the car and onto the road. As he lay on the ground, seriously injured and defenseless, the attackers surrounded him. In the space of just 14 seconds, they stabbed him 9 times. The entire assault was captured on CCTV cameras. Jaden Moody bled to death on the streets of Leighton. He became the youngest victim of gang violence in London that year. Among those responsible was 19-year-old Ayoub Magdalene, a drug dealer who admitted working for the Mali Boys. Magdalene's own background was marked by tragedy. His father had been murdered 3 years earlier, and in the aftermath, he had been identified by the National Crime Agency as a victim of modern slavery, having been groomed and exploited by the gang. His barrister would later describe him as someone who had a non-existent childhood and was particularly traumatized by his father's death. None of this excused what he had done. DNA evidence linked Magdalene to the killing. His genetic material was found on a bloody yellow rubber glove and a knife discarded after the attack. CCTV footage from a Travelodge hotel the day before showed him wearing distinctive Nike Air Max trainers, the same ones visible in the footage of the murder. At trial, the prosecutor described the attack as a killing mission. Jaden's mother, Jada Bailey, called her son's murder barbaric and described his killers as cowards. In December 2019, Magdalene was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. The case brought unprecedented public attention to the Mali Boys and the violence consuming the streets of Waltham Forest. In the aftermath of the Jaden Moody murder, law enforcement efforts against the Mali Boys intensified considerably. A series of prosecutions followed, which would see several of the gang's most prominent members sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Hamza ul Haq, who had been identified as a central figure in the Mali Boys' leadership, faced trial for his role in multiple killings. In 2020, he was convicted of the murder of Joseph Williams Torres, the innocent man shot dead in a case of mistaken identity in March 2018. Ul Haq was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years, but the prosecutions did not end there. In May 2023, following a 3-month trial at the Old Bailey, he was also convicted of the murder of Katem Mokrane, the 18-year-old stabbed to death in November 2017. Judge Angela Rafferty, KC, imposed a combined minimum term of 36 years before Ul Haq would be eligible for parole. Co-defendants Abdirizak Ali, Luca Griffiths, and Kamil Kazmierski were also convicted for their roles in the Mokrane killing. Other prosecutions followed. Wayne Russell received 16 years for firearms offences connected to the gang's activities. In November 2021, 5 members of the Mali Boys were convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs to Essex, evidence of the gang's county lines operations extending beyond London. The Crown Prosecution Service described the convicted individuals as members of a dangerous criminal gang whose removal from the streets would make the capital a safer place. Yet despite these successful prosecutions, the Mali Boys have not been dismantled. The gang continues to operate in Waltham Forest, albeit with its leadership significantly depleted. New recruits have taken the places of those imprisoned, and the county lines networks established in the late 2010s remain active. The demand for crack cocaine and heroin in provincial towns has not diminished, and as long as that demand persists, organizations like the Mali Boys will find ways to supply it. Witness intimidation continues to hamper investigations, with residents in affected areas still too frightened to cooperate with police. The use of children as drug runners has complicated prosecutions, as defense teams increasingly argue that young defendants are themselves victims of modern slavery and criminal exploitation. The story of the Mali Boys reflects broader patterns in British gang culture and raises difficult questions about how such organizations emerge and persist. What do you think of the Mali Boys? Are they simply ruthless criminals who chose their path? Or are they a symptom of broader societal failures that continue to produce such organizations? The emergence of the Mali Boys cannot be understood in isolation from the systemic failures that created the conditions for their rise. Waltham Forest, like many London boroughs, underwent profound demographic and economic transformation in the decades preceding the gang's formation. Between 2001 and 2011, the borough experienced one of the highest rates of population growth in England, driven largely by immigration. The Somali community, as we have seen, formed a significant part of this influx, fleeing civil war and seeking refuge in a country whose institutions were often ill-equipped to support them. Youth services, which had once provided alternatives to gang involvement, were systematically dismantled. Between 2010 and 2019, following the implementation of austerity policies, local authority spending on youth services in England fell by nearly 70% in real terms. Waltham Forest was not exempt from these cuts. Youth clubs closed. Outreach programs were defunded. The spaces where young people might have found mentorship, purpose, and belonging simply disappeared. Educational exclusion rates among young Somali boys were disproportionately high. A report by the Runnymede Trust found that Black Caribbean and Black African children, including those of Somali heritage, were 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than their white British peers. Once excluded, these young people became invisible to support systems and highly visible to gangs offering alternative structures of belonging and income. Dr. Simon Harding, a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of West London, has argued that gangs like the Mali Boys function as surrogate families for young people who lack stable support networks. The gang provides identity, protection, and a sense of purpose in neighborhoods where legitimate pathways to status and success appear blocked. For a 14-year-old boy excluded from school, living in temporary accommodation, with few positive male role models, the promise of £500 a day dealing drugs can seem not merely attractive, but rational. The role of social media and drill music in glamorizing gang culture has been extensively debated. While the Mali Boys themselves maintained operational anonymity, the broader landscape of London gang culture had become increasingly performative by the mid-2010s. Drill music, a subgenre of hip-hop characterized by dark, aggressive beats and often violent lyrics, emerged from Chicago before taking root in South London around 2012. By 2015, it had become the dominant sound of British gang culture. Groups like 67, 150, and Zone 2 accumulated millions of views on YouTube with tracks that referenced real acts of violence, taunted rival gangs by name, and celebrated street credibility earned through bloodshed. The Metropolitan Police formed dedicated units to monitor drill videos, arguing that they incited violence and could be used as evidence of gang affiliation. In some cases, prosecutors presented drill lyrics in court to demonstrate a defendant's involvement in gang activity or violent intent. Yet, the relationship between drill music and actual violence remains contested. Supporters argue that drill is simply artistic expression emerging from lived experience in deprived communities, no different in principle from gangster rap or punk rock before it. They point out that the vast majority of young people who listen to drill music never engage in violence. Critics counter that the genre glorifies criminality, perpetuates cycles of revenge, and serves as a recruitment tool for gangs seeking to project power and attract young members eager for status. The Mali Boys' deliberate avoidance of social media representation suggests a more calculated approach. While rivals courted notoriety through YouTube channels and Instagram posts, the Mali Boys recognized that such visibility attracted unwanted police attention. Their business model prioritized profit over reputation, a distinction that marked them as more sophisticated than many contemporary gangs. The response: policing, prevention, and the limits of intervention. Law enforcement responses to gang violence in Waltham Forest evolved significantly throughout the 2010s, though not always successfully. The Metropolitan Police's Trident Gang Crime Command, established in 1998 to tackle gun crime in London's black communities, had by the 2010s expanded its remit to address all forms of serious gang-related violence. Officers employed a range of tactics, including intelligence gathering, surveillance operations, the use of informants, and targeted prosecutions of gang leaders. The strategy was to disrupt criminal enterprises by removing key figures, thereby destabilizing the organizational structures that allowed gangs to function. This approach achieved notable successes, as evidenced by the lengthy sentences handed down to Hamza ul Haq and other Mali Boys leadership figures. Yet, the impact of such prosecutions proved limited. For every senior gang member imprisoned, younger recruits stepped forward to fill the vacuum. The structure of county lines operations, with their deliberate separation between leadership and street-level activity, made it difficult to dismantle entire networks. Arresting the runners did little to disrupt supply chains when new runners could be recruited within days. Gang injunctions, introduced under the Policing and Crime Act 2009, offered another tool. These civil orders prohibited individuals from entering certain areas, associating with specified persons, or wearing particular items of clothing that signified gang affiliation. Breach of an injunction could result in imprisonment of up to 2 years. Between 2010 and 2019, London courts issued hundreds of gang injunctions, though their effectiveness remained disputed. Critics argued that such orders criminalized association rather than actions and could be counterproductive, pushing young people further from mainstream society into deeper gang involvement. Prevention efforts focused on early intervention proved more promising, though consistently underfunded. The concept of the teachable moment emerged from research into youth violence. The idea was simple. When a young person presents at a hospital emergency department after being stabbed or assaulted, they experience a moment of profound vulnerability in which they may be receptive to help. Violence reduction units deployed specially trained youth workers to hospital wards, offering support, mediation with rival gangs, and pathways out of violence during these critical windows. The charity Red Thread pioneered this approach in London, embedding youth workers in hospital emergency departments to engage young victims of violence. Evaluation studies suggested that such interventions reduce the likelihood of repeat attendance at emergency departments for violence-related injuries. Yet the scale of such programs remained modest compared to the scale of the problem. By 2019, Red Thread operated in just a handful of London hospitals, and similar programs existed in only a few cities nationwide. Mentoring schemes, diversionary activities, and employment programs all showed promise in limited trials. The Ben Kinsella Trust, established after the murder of 16-year-old Ben Kinsella in 2008, delivered educational workshops in schools across London, using the stories of knife crime victims to illustrate the consequences of violence. The Prince's Trust provided training and employment support specifically targeted at young people at risk of gang involvement. Yet, for every success story, countless other young people slipped through the cracks. The fundamental problem was one of scale and resources. Even the most effective intervention programs could reach only a fraction of the at-risk population. Youth services had been eviscerated by austerity. Schools struggling with budget cuts had limited capacity to support troubled pupils. Social services were overwhelmed. The institutions that might have caught young people before they fell into gang involvement had been systematically weakened precisely when demographic and economic pressures made them most necessary. County lines, a national crisis. The county lines model pioneered by gangs like the Marley Boys had by 2019 metastasized into a national crisis affecting every region of the United Kingdom. The National Crime Agency estimated that criminal networks were operating over 2,000 individual deal lines, generating hundreds of millions of pounds annually. The exploitation of children had reached industrial scale. According to the Children's Society, at least 27,000 children were involved in county lines activity by 23, though the true figure was likely far higher, given the hidden nature of the crime. The geographic scope was staggering. Urban gangs from London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool established supply routes into coastal towns, market towns, and rural areas where local drug markets had previously been served by small-scale dealers. Yarmouth, Exeter, Ipswich, Swansea, Torquay, Grimsby. Dozens of towns across England and Wales found themselves suddenly connected to metropolitan gang networks. The pattern was consistent. A gang would establish a phone line advertised to local drug users. Runners, often children as young as 12, would be dispatched from the city by train, sometimes hundreds of miles, carrying consignments of crack cocaine and heroin. They would take over the home of a vulnerable adult through cuckooing or operate from cheap hotels. The drugs would be sold, the cash collected, and the runners rotated back to the city, often within 24 to 48 hours. The local police, unfamiliar with sophisticated urban gang operations, struggled to respond effectively. For the gangs, County lines offered enormous advantages. Provincial markets had less competition, higher profit margins, and lower risk of violence than urban territories where rival gangs fought for every street corner. Police resources in small towns were more limited than in major cities. The physical distance between the gang's urban base and its rural markets made it harder for law enforcement to build cases connecting street-level dealing to the London leadership. For the children exploited in this system, the consequences were devastating. They were removed from school, from family, from any semblance of normal childhood. They faced constant risk of violence from rival gangs, from customers who robbed them, from the very dealers who employed them. If arrested, they entered the criminal justice system with records that would haunt them for life. Many developed drug addictions themselves. Some were sexually exploited. Those who tried to leave faced threats against their families. The government response, while eventually substantial, took years to materialize. In 2018, the Home Office published a serious violence strategy, which for the first time acknowledged county lines as a national priority. Funding was allocated for specialist police teams. The National County Lines Coordination Centre was established to share intelligence across forces. Operation Orochi, a coordinated response involving multiple police forces, led to thousands of arrests and the closure of hundreds of drug lines. Yet the underlying market dynamics remained unchanged. As long as demand for crack cocaine and heroin persisted in provincial towns, and as long as urban gangs could recruit vulnerable children to exploit, the county lines model would continue to function. Closing one drug line simply meant another would open to fill the vacuum. Arresting street-level runners did nothing to dismantle the organizational structures behind them. Some commentators argued for more radical solutions. Dame Carol Black, in her comprehensive review of drugs policy published in 2021, recommended a major expansion of drug treatment services, arguing that reducing demand was essential to undermining criminal markets. Others advocated for decriminalization or even legalization of certain drugs, pointing to the Portuguese model where personal drug use was treated as a health issue rather than a criminal matter. Such approaches remained politically contentious in the United Kingdom, where successive governments maintained a commitment to prohibition despite evidence of its limited effectiveness. International parallels and the globalization of gang culture. The story of the Mali boys, while rooted in the specific circumstances of East London and the Somali diaspora, reflects patterns visible in gang cultures across the developed world. In the United States, where gang culture has been studied for over a century, researchers have documented similar evolutions from territorial street gangs to profit-driven criminal enterprises. The Gangster Disciples in Chicago, the Bloods and Crips in Los Angeles, and countless smaller organizations underwent transformations comparable to those observed in London. As crack cocaine markets matured in the 1980s and 1990s, American gangs increasingly prioritized drug distribution over territorial defense, adopted more sophisticated organizational structures, and professionalized their operations. The Mexican cartels represent perhaps the most extreme evolution of this model. What began as loose networks of marijuana smugglers in the 1970s evolved by the 2000s into transnational criminal enterprises with military-grade weaponry, sophisticated money laundering operations, and the capacity to corrupt entire government institutions. The Sinaloa Cartel, Los Zetas, and Jalisco New Generation Cartel control supply chains stretching from South American coca fields to North American street corners, generating tens of billions of dollars annually. In Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, gang violence has increased dramatically in recent years, with conflicts often involving members of immigrant communities. Swedish police reported over 350 shootings in 2022 alone, many connected to gang disputes over drug territories. The parallels with London are striking. The involvement of diaspora communities, the exploitation of vulnerable young people, the shift from territorial to commercial gang structures. What these international comparisons reveal is that gang formation and evolution follow predictable patterns when certain conditions align. Economic marginalization, particularly among immigrant and minority communities, creates pools of young people vulnerable to recruitment. The illegal drug trade provides the economic opportunity that gangs exploit. Weak or overstretched institutions fail to offer legitimate alternatives. Once established, gangs develop increasingly sophisticated structures that prove resilient to law enforcement pressure. The globalization of gang culture has been facilitated by several factors. Social media allows gang members across different countries to observe and emulate each other's tactics, aesthetics, and organizational models. The international drug trade connects local gangs to transnational criminal networks. Migration patterns mean that gang members may have connections spanning multiple countries, facilitating the flow of drugs, weapons, and money across borders. Yet, there are also important distinctions between gang cultures in different contexts. American gangs operate in a country with widespread legal gun ownership, fundamentally altering the lethality of gang violence. Swedish gangs emerged in a welfare state with robust social services, suggesting that even strong institutional support cannot entirely prevent gang formation under certain conditions. British gangs developed in a context of relatively strict gun control, leading to greater reliance on knife violence and creating different risk calculations for both gang members and law enforcement. Understanding these international patterns provides perspective on the Mali Boys phenomenon. They are not an aberration or a uniquely British problem, but rather a local manifestation of global dynamics in urban crime, drug markets, and the marginalization of vulnerable populations. The human cost. Voices from the community. Behind the statistics and the court cases lie human lives irreversibly altered by gang violence. Jada Bailey, Jaden Moody's mother, became an advocate for knife crime prevention following her son's murder. In interviews and public appearances, she spoke of the trauma of losing a child to senseless violence, of the guilt she carried for sending him to London, thinking it would be safer than Nottingham, of the rage she felt toward a system that had failed to protect him. She established the Jaden Moody Foundation to support young people at risk of gang involvement, transforming her grief into action. The families of other victims, Kachem Mokrane, Joseph Williams Torres, Elijah Dornelly, were left with similar burdens. Some sought to honor their loved ones through activism. Others withdrew from public life, unable to face the constant reminders of their loss. The psychological toll extended to siblings, parents, grandparents, cousins, and friends, creating ripples of trauma through entire communities. Residents in areas controlled by the Mali Boys described living in a state of constant fear. In interviews conducted by local media, mothers spoke of keeping their children indoors after dark, of planning routes to avoid certain streets, of the anxiety that accompanied every time their sons left the house. Shop owners told of being forced to allow gang members to congregate outside their premises, of witnessing drug deals and violence while knowing that reporting to police might make them targets. Community workers described the exhaustion of trying to provide youth services with minimal resources while watching young people they knew get drawn into gang life. The gang members themselves, particularly the younger recruits, often presented a more complex picture than the simplistic categories of victim or perpetrator might suggest. Many had experienced trauma, family violence, parental abandonment, abuse, before their gang involvement. Their recruitment by gangs frequently followed school exclusion, family breakdown, or periods in care. Defense lawyers in gang trials routinely presented evidence of modern slavery and criminal exploitation, arguing that their clients were themselves victims of the very criminal networks they had joined. Ayub Majdoulin, convicted of murdering Jaden Moody, had witnessed his own father's murder just 3 years earlier. The National Crime Agency identified him as a victim of modern slavery, even as prosecutors sought a murder conviction against him. This dual reality, simultaneously victim and perpetrator, characterizes many young gang members and complicates simple narratives about criminal responsibility. Youth workers operating in Waltham Forest described the difficulty of their work. They spoke of building relationships with young people over months or years, slowly earning trust, offering alternatives to gang life. Sometimes they succeeded in steering a teenager toward education, employment, or simply away from violence. More often, they watched helplessly as the gravitational pull of gang involvement proved too strong, as the promise of money and status and belonging overwhelmed the uncertain possibilities of legitimate paths. The trauma extended to the gang members who survived. Those sentenced to decades in prison would serve their time in young offender institutions and adult prisons, exposed to further violence and criminality, with minimal rehabilitation support. Upon eventual release, they would face the challenge of building lives with criminal records that barred them from most employment, in communities where gang affiliations might still make them targets, with few support systems to prevent recidivism. This human dimension, the accumulated grief, fear, and wasted potential, represents perhaps the most devastating consequence of gang culture. Each statistic conceals a person whose life might have taken a different course under different circumstances. To understand the Mali Boys, we must first understand the long trajectory of organized crime in Britain, a history that stretches back centuries but underwent profound transformation in the post-war period. The British public's conception of gangsters has long been dominated by figures from an earlier era. The Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, ruled London's East End during the 1950s and 1960s through a combination of violence, protection rackets, and nightclub ownership. Their world was one of sharp suits, celebrity connections, and a code of honor, however twisted, that governed criminal conduct. They were white, working-class men who emerged from a specific cultural milieu of post-war East London, a time when the docks still provided employment, and when territorial boundaries were clearly defined by ethnicity and class. The Krays represented what criminologists would later term traditional organized crime. Their operations were locally rooted, personally controlled, and based on long-standing relationships forged in specific neighborhoods. When they wanted to eliminate a rival, they did it themselves or through trusted associates. When they needed to intimidate witnesses, they relied on their fearsome reputations and face-to-face threats. The structure was hierarchical, patriarchal, and built on personal loyalty enforced through violence. This model began to fragment in the 1970s and 1980s as British society underwent seismic demographic and economic changes. The decline of traditional industries, the docks, manufacturing, mining, destroyed the economic foundations of working-class communities. Unemployment soared, particularly among young men who might once have found secure work in their father's trades. The social fabric of areas like the East End unraveled as stable employment disappeared. Simultaneously, Britain was becoming a multicultural society on an unprecedented scale. The Windrush generation of Caribbean migrants who arrived in the late 1940s and 1950s had established communities across London, Birmingham, Manchester, and other cities. South Asian immigration followed. By the 1980s, African migration was increasing, including Somalis fleeing instability in their homeland. These new communities faced systematic discrimination in housing, employment, and education, concentrating poverty and marginalization along racial lines. Into this volatile mixture came crack cocaine. The drug arrived in Britain from the United States in the late 1980s, transforming the landscape of urban crime almost overnight. Unlike powder cocaine, which remained primarily a drug of the middle classes, crack was cheap, intensely addictive, and marketable to the most deprived populations. A wrap could be sold for as little as £10, making it accessible to the poorest users while generating enormous profits through volume. The crack trade created opportunities for a new generation of criminals, many of them young black men from Caribbean backgrounds who faced blocked opportunities in the legitimate economy. The Yardie gangs, originally from Jamaica, established themselves in Brixton, Hackney, and other areas with large Caribbean populations. Their willingness to use extreme violence, particularly gun violence, marked a departure from the older criminal establishment. Shootings became commonplace in areas that had previously seen little gun crime. By the 1990s, British gang culture had begun to take recognizable shape. The postcode gangs emerged, young men defending their estates and streets from rivals. These were not professional criminal organizations in the traditional sense, but loose affiliations of teenagers and young adults. bound by geography and shared identity. The gangs took names from their postcodes: the Peckham Boys, the Tottenham Mandem, the Ghetto Boys from Birmingham, and their conflicts often appeared senseless to outsiders. A young man might be attacked simply for straying into the wrong postcode, even if he had no gang affiliation whatsoever. Researchers studying this phenomenon identified several key features. Gang membership provided identity and belonging for young men who felt excluded from mainstream society. It offered protection in dangerous neighborhoods where walking alone could invite attack. It created a sense of territory and ownership in communities where young people had little control over their lives. And crucially, it provided access to the drug trade, which by the 2000s had become the economic engine of gang culture. Professor John Pitts of the University of Bedfordshire, who conducted extensive research on gangs in Waltham Forest, described the evolution he observed. In the early 2000s, gangs were primarily about territory and respect. Drug dealing was incidental, something individuals might do, but not the primary purpose of the gang itself. By the 2010s, this had inverted. Drug dealing had become the central activity, with territory valuable primarily as marketplace. The emotional attachment to postcodes remained, but increasingly it was subordinated to commercial logic. This evolution was driven by several factors. First, successful dealers accumulated wealth and demonstrated that serious money could be made from drugs. Second, the county lines model emerged, showing how urban gangs could expand beyond their traditional territories into lucrative provincial markets. Third, competition intensified as more gangs entered the market, forcing professionalization. Those who treated drug dealing as a business thrived. Those who remained focused on territorial beefs for their own sake found themselves marginalized or absorbed by more sophisticated operations. The Marley Boys emerged at the end of this evolutionary trajectory. They were not the first London gang to prioritize business over territory, but they exemplified the model in its mature form. Their Somali heritage distinguished them from the predominantly Caribbean background gangs that had dominated in previous decades, reflecting the changing demographics of London's most marginalized communities. But their operational methods, their exploitation of children, their use of county lines, their systematic violence, all of this placed them firmly within a tradition of British gang evolution that stretched back decades. What made them particularly dangerous was their timing. They emerged just as the county lines model was proving its profitability, just as drill music was glamorizing gang culture for a new generation, just as austerity policies were eviscerating the youth services that might have provided alternatives. They were able to learn from the mistakes of earlier gangs while exploiting opportunities those gangs had helped create. The Somali diaspora, from civil war to East London streets. The story of the Marley Boys cannot be separated from the larger tragedy of Somalia and its diaspora. To understand how young Somali men came to dominate a drug gang in East London requires understanding the catastrophic events that scattered the Somali people across the globe. Somalia, located on the Horn of Africa, gained independence from British and Italian colonial rule in 1960. The new republic united British Somaliland in the north with Italian Somaliland in the south, creating a nation of predominantly Somali-speaking people united by culture, language, and Islam. For a time, there was optimism that Somalia might become a stable, prosperous nation. Those hopes were dashed by dictatorship and war. In 1969, Major General Mohammed Siad Barre seized power in a coup and established a military dictatorship that would rule for over 2 decades. Initially embracing scientific socialism and receiving support from the Soviet Union, Barre's regime grew increasingly authoritarian and clan-based. Political opposition was brutally suppressed. The military grew powerful and predatory. When Barre switched allegiance to the United States after the Somali-Ethiopian War of 1977 to 1978, American military aid flowed into a state apparatus that used it to maintain internal control. By the late 1980s, armed opposition movements had emerged across Somalia. The Somali National Movement in the north, the United Somali Congress in the center, and other factions began guerrilla campaigns against Barre's regime. The government response was savage. In 1988, government forces attacked the northern city of Hargeisa with artillery and aerial bombardment, killing tens of thousands and displacing hundreds of thousands more. It was effectively genocide directed against the Isaac clan, which dominated the north. In January 1991, Barre fled Mogadishu as rebel forces closed in. What followed was not liberation, but catastrophe. Without a common enemy, the various opposition factions turned on each other. Somalia descended into a civil war that would continue in various forms for decades. The country fractured along clan lines. Warlords seized control of regions and neighborhoods. The state collapsed entirely. Institutions ceased to function. The rule of law evaporated. The humanitarian catastrophe was immense. Famine killed hundreds of thousands in 1991 and 1992 as warfare disrupted agriculture and aid distribution. The United Nations intervened with peacekeeping forces, but the mission ended in disaster after American forces were killed in the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, an event immortalized in the book and film Black Hawk Down. The peacekeepers withdrew, leaving Somalia to its fate. From this hell, Somalis fled by the hundreds of thousands. They went first to refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia, enduring years in conditions of squalor and danger. From there, many sought resettlement in the West. Some went to the United States, particularly Minnesota, which developed a large Somali population. Others went to Canada, Australia, and various European nations, and many came to the United Kingdom. The Somali refugees who arrived in Britain in the 1990s and 2000s carried enormous trauma. Many had witnessed atrocities. Many had lost family members to violence or starvation. Mothers arrived without husbands who had been killed or who remained behind fighting. Children had grown up in refugee camps or war zones, their educations interrupted, their childhood stolen. They came seeking safety and opportunity, but found themselves in a country ill-prepared to meet their needs. The British asylum system, overwhelmed by the sudden influx, struggled to process claims efficiently. Families spent years in limbo, housed in temporary accommodation, unable to work legally, dependent on minimal state support. Many Somalis were dispersed to areas with no existing Somali community, isolating them further. When asylum was eventually granted, integration challenges remained severe. Language barriers were immense. Many Somali women, particularly those from rural areas, spoke little or no English. The British education system struggled to accommodate children who arrived with interrupted schooling and trauma-related behavioral problems. Somali parents, particularly mothers raising children alone, often lacked understanding of British institutions and found themselves unable to navigate systems of education, healthcare, and social services. Professional qualifications from Somalia were not recognized in Britain. Doctors, teachers, and engineers found themselves unable to practice their professions. Many took menial jobs or remained unemployed. The combination of unemployment, inadequate housing, and cultural dislocation created conditions of profound stress within Somali families. For Somali youth, the challenges were particularly acute. They grew up straddling two worlds: the traditional Somali culture of their parents, with its emphasis on Islam, clan identity, and respect for elders, and the inner-city British youth culture of their neighborhoods and schools. Many struggled with this dual identity. Some felt rejected by both cultures, too British for their Somali relatives and too Somali for their British peers. Educational underachievement became endemic. Research by the Runnymede Trust and other organizations found that Somali pupils were among the lowest performing ethnic groups in British schools. Factors included language difficulties, interrupted prior education, poverty at home, and cultural barriers that made parental engagement with schools difficult. Exclusion rates were disproportionately high. Once excluded, these young people became disconnected from the main pathway for social mobility. Into this vacuum stepped the gangs. For young Somali men in areas like Waltham Forest, gangs offered what mainstream society did not: belonging, identity, protection, and economic opportunity. The gang became a substitute family for those whose families had been fractured by war and migration. It provided a clear structure and hierarchy for those adrift between cultures. It offered respect and status in neighborhoods where legitimate paths to these goods seemed blocked, and critically, it provided money. The tragedy was that many young Somalis who joined gangs were not by nature criminal. They were products of circumstances almost incomprehensibly difficult. A boy born in Mogadishu in 1997, at the height of the Civil War, might have spent his first years in a refugee camp in Kenya, arrived in London at age 5, speaking no English, grown up in temporary accommodation in a tower block in Leighton, attended schools where he was one of few Somali pupils, been excluded at age 13 for behavioral problems linked to undiagnosed trauma, and found himself at age 15 on the streets with no qualifications, no job prospects, and no sense of belonging anywhere. When the Mali boys offered him up to £500 a day to run drugs, a phone, new trainers, and brothers who would protect him, the choice might have seemed obvious. This is not to absolve responsibility for the violence and exploitation that followed. Many young Somalis growing up in equally difficult circumstances did not join gangs. They worked hard in school, supported their families, built legitimate careers. But to understand the Mali Boys phenomenon requires acknowledging the extraordinary challenges faced by the community from which they emerged. The Somali community itself was often the first victim of gang activity. Elders who had survived civil war and built new lives in Britain watched in anguish as their children and grandchildren were drawn into criminality. Somali mothers formed groups to try to steer young people away from gangs, often at considerable personal risk. Somali businesses were extorted. Somali families lived in fear of gang violence in their own neighborhoods. There was also a dangerous tendency in media coverage to conflate the actions of gang members with the Somali community as a whole. The vast majority of British Somalis had no connection to gangs. They were taxi drivers, nurses, shopkeepers, students, working people trying to build better lives for their families. The criminal activities of groups like the Mali Boys brought unwanted attention and reinforced stereotypes that the entire community was forced to contest. Community leaders emphasized that gang involvement was a failure of British society as much as of Somali families. If proper support had been provided to refugees fleeing civil war, if trauma had been acknowledged and treated, if education and employment pathways had been opened rather than blocked, if youth services had existed to provide alternatives, then perhaps the Mali Boys would never have formed. The gang was, in this reading, a symptom of Britain's failure to properly integrate the Somali diaspora, a failure with roots in inadequate asylum policies, insufficient funding for integration support, and the broader marginalization of immigrant communities. Inside the machine, the economics and operations of a modern drug gang. To truly understand the Mali Boys, we must examine the nuts and bolts of their criminal enterprise, how they sourced drugs, how they distributed them, how they managed personnel, and how they generated and laundered their enormous profits. The supply chain began, like most British drug networks, far from the streets of Leighton. Crack cocaine and heroin do not originate in the United Kingdom. Cocaine is produced from coca leaves grown primarily in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The leaves are processed into cocaine paste, then refined into powder cocaine in laboratories hidden in the jungles and mountains of South America. Heroin originates from opium poppies grown primarily in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Mexico. The opium is refined into morphine base and then into heroin. These drugs then travel thousands of miles through complex trafficking networks before reaching British streets. Cocaine typically travels from South America to West Africa by boat or aircraft, then onwards to Europe. Alternatively, it moves through Central America and Mexico to North America, then across the Atlantic. Heroin from Afghanistan travels through Iran and Turkey, through the Balkans, and into Western Europe. Multiple criminal organizations are involved at each stage, each taking their profit. By the time drugs reach the United Kingdom, they have already passed through multiple hands. Large shipments are imported by serious organized crime groups with international connections. These might be British organized crime families, Albanian crime networks, Turkish groups, or international cartels. The drugs arrive by various means: hidden in shipping containers, concealed in vehicles on ferries, transported by air couriers, or smuggled through the Channel Tunnel. The Mali boys, like most street gangs, operated far down this supply chain. They did not import drugs themselves. Instead, they purchased wholesale from mid-level suppliers who had access to the imported product. These suppliers might be more established criminal organizations or individual wholesalers who had built connections over years in the trade. The drugs purchased by the Mali boys arrived in relatively pure form. Cocaine at perhaps 60 to 80% purity, heroin at similar levels. The gang would then process these drugs for street sale. Cocaine was converted into crack through a simple chemical process involving baking soda and water. The resulting rocks of crack could be smoked, producing an intense but short-lived high that made it highly addictive and profitable due to repeat purchases. Both crack and heroin were then divided into wraps, small packages containing roughly 0.1 grams of drug. These wraps were typically stored in the mouths of street dealers, allowing them to be swallowed quickly if police approached. Each wrap sold for £5 to £10, depending on the market and competition. The margins were enormous. A kilogram of cocaine purchased wholesale for perhaps £25,000 to £30,000 could be converted into crack and divided into wraps worth £100,000 or more at street prices. The daily operations of drug dealing required sophisticated organization. The Mali boys operated multiple dealing locations across their territory, each with its own team of dealers, runners, and spotters. A typical operation might work as follows. The day would begin with a supply run. A trusted member of the gang would collect that day's allocation of drugs from a stash house where larger quantities were stored. This might be several hundred wraps of crack and heroin. The drugs would be distributed to the street dealers working that day, with each given perhaps 50, 100 wraps to sell. The dealers would take up positions at known dealing locations, particular street corners, alleyways, or near housing estates where customers knew to find them. Spotters, often younger boys, would watch for police. If officers were spotted, a signal would go out, a shout, a phone call, a particular gesture, and the dealers would quickly move or swallow their stock. Customers would approach, often well-known regulars, and request their purchase. Money would change hands, drugs would be handed over. The transaction might take seconds,